The massive council chamber stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy sat in their assigned seats, their voices creating a low rumble that echoed off the crystal walls. The air itself seemed heavy with fear and desperation. High Counselor Zeftari stood at the center of the chamber. Her crystalline body caught the light from 1,000 different worlds, casting rainbow patterns on the floor. She had lived for over 3,000 years and had never seen the council in such panic. "Citizens of the galaxy," she began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "We face our greatest threat in recorded history. The void barriers are failing." A wave of frightened sounds swept through the chamber. Clicks, chirps, growls, and telepathic bursts of terror filled the air. Everyone knew what this meant. The barriers had protected their dimension for millions of years, keeping the hungry darkness at bay. "Our scientists estimate complete failure in 24 hours, Zeftari continued. "The entities from the void dimension will pour through. They will consume everything in their path. Reality itself will be devoured." Ambassador Krell of the Kethmori stood up. His tall gray form swayed slightly as he spoke. "High Counselor, my people have worked on this problem for 800 years. Our greatest minds have studied every aspect of the barriers. There is no solution. The technology is beyond our understanding." Murmurs of agreement came from across the chamber. The Kethmori were known throughout the galaxy for their intelligence. If they said something was impossible, most species believed them. General Thex of the Silthek military forces raised one of her forearms. "My engineers have run 10 million simulations. Every possible repair method fails. The barriers use technology that makes our most advanced systems look like stone tools." More voices joined in. Representative after representative stood to report the same thing. The ancient Vorthai, masters of dimensional science for 50,000 years, had declared the task impossible. The tech-savvy Mirandin had tried to interface with the barrier systems and nearly lost their entire research. "Team to mental feedback. Evacuation has begun," announced Admiral Korthak of the evacuation fleet. "But we cannot move billions of beings in 24 hours. Most worlds along the barrier zone will be lost." The chamber fell into grim silence. Everyone understood the math. When the barriers failed, the void entities would spread like a plague across the galaxy. World after world would fall until nothing remained but empty space and hungry darkness. That was when Ambassador Sarah Chen stood up. She was small compared to most of the other beings in the chamber. Humans were a young species, having only developed space travel 500 years ago. Most older races saw them as reckless children who had gotten lucky with a few technological breakthroughs. "High Counselor," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. "The human government requests permission to attempt a solution." The chamber exploded into noise. Laughter, scoffing sounds, and waves of telepathic disbelief crashed over the human delegation. Several beings openly mocked the suggestion. "The barriers have stood for millions of years," called out Minister Vexthai of the ancient Lordanis Empire. "Species with 10,000 years more experience than yours have failed." "What could humans possibly offer?" Sarah waited for the noise to die down before responding. "We offer a fresh perspective. Sometimes the obvious solution is the wrong one." Counselor Zeftari studied the human ambassador. She had dealt with humans before and found them to be unpredictable. They had a strange way of solving problems that often surprised older species. "Ambassador Chen," Zeftari said slowly, "you understand the consequences of failure? If your species attempts this and fails, you will be blamed for wasting precious time that could have been used for evacuation." "We understand," Sarah replied. "But we also understand that doing nothing guarantees failure." "Give us the chance," the chamber erupted again. This time the noise was angry rather than amused. Representative Korthvel of the Axis Alliance slammed his massive fist on his speaking platform. "This is madness," he roared. "Humans have been in space for barely 5 centuries. The Kethmori have studied this problem for 8 times longer than humans have had electricity. And yet the problem remains unsolved," Sarah pointed out calmly. "Maybe it needs someone who hasn't spent centuries thinking inside the same box." Elder Sithray of the Wisdom Keepers floated forward on her energy platform. Her ancient voice carried the weight of eons. "Child species, you do not understand the forces at work here. The barriers channel energies that could tear apart solar systems. The mathematics involved require understanding of 17 different dimensions. Your species has barely mastered 3-dimensional thinking." But Dr. Marcus Webb, sitting behind Sarah in the human delegation, smiled slightly. He had been studying the barrier data for 6 months now. While other species had approached the problem with traditional physics and engineering, he had been looking at it from a completely different angle. Elder Sithray, Sarah said respectfully, you are correct that we lack your ancient wisdom. But sometimes wisdom can become a prison. Sometimes the beginner sees what the expert cannot. The debate continued for another hour. Species after species stood to explain why the human attempt was doomed to fail. They listed their qualifications, their centuries of research, their failed attempts. Each argument made the same point. If they could not solve the problem, how could humans possibly succeed? Finally, Zeftari called for order. The chamber fell silent as she considered the situation. Outside the great windows, the stars seemed to flicker as reality itself began to weaken near the failing barriers. The human request is noted, she announced. Given the desperate nature of our situation, and the fact that all conventional approaches have failed, this council grants humanity permission to attempt their solution. The chamber erupted one final time. Shouts of protest mixed with expressions of disbelief. Some representatives stormed out in anger. Others simply shook their heads in resignation. Sarah Chen stood quietly in the center of the storm. She knew what most of the council thought of her species. Humans were seen as aggressive, unpredictable, and dangerously optimistic. They took risks that more sensible species would never consider. But that was exactly what this situation required. As the session ended and the representatives began to file out, many stopped to offer the human delegation their condolences. They spoke as if to mourners at a funeral, certain that humanity was about to embarrass itself on a galactic stage. Dr. Webb approached Sarah as the chamber emptied. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. She looked up at the great display showing the barrier status. Red warning lights blinked across a map of their galaxy. Time was running out fast, no, she admitted. But when has that ever stopped us? Webb chuckled. Never. That's what makes us human. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah thought about what lay ahead. In 24 hours, the barriers would fail completely. Every expert in the galaxy had said the task was impossible. The greatest minds of 100 civilizations had tried and failed, but humans had never been particularly good at accepting the word impossible. The countdown had begun. Dr. Marcus Webb stood in front of the holographic display showing the void barriers. The massive energy constructs stretched across space like giant spider webs made of pure light. Each strand pulsed with power that could fuel entire star systems. Yet they were failing piece by piece. "Show me the failure pattern again," he said to his assistant, Dr. Lisa Park. The display shifted, showing how the barriers had been breaking down over the past 3 years. Red areas marked where the energy matrix had already collapsed. Yellow zones showed critical weakness. There was very little green left. Every other species has tried to fix the weak spots directly, Lisa observed. The Keth Mori attempted to reinforce the failing sections with their own energy sources. The Siltic tried to rebuild the damaged areas using their best engineering. All failed. Webb nodded slowly. He had spent months studying these attempts. Each one had been carefully planned and expertly executed. Each one had been based on centuries of research and deep understanding of advanced physics. And each one had failed completely. "They're all thinking like engineers," he said finally. "They see a broken machine and try to fix it. But what if it's not a machine at all?" Behind them, the human task force was assembling at incredible speed. Ships from across human space were racing toward the barrier coordinates. The response time would have impressed even the efficiency-obsessed Mirandan. When humans decided to act, they moved fast. Captain Elena Vasquez entered the research lab with a tablet full of updates. "The Prometheus is ready for modification. Engineering teams are standing by. We have volunteers for the mission." "How many volunteers?" Webb asked. 12,000, Elena replied without blinking. "We had to turn most of them away." Webb was not surprised. When faced with impossible odds, humans had a strange tendency to run toward danger rather than away from it. Other species called it recklessness. Humans called it Tuesday. "The mission profile is insane," Dr. Park pointed out. "We're asking someone to manually calibrate resonance frequencies from inside the barrier matrix itself. The energy levels there would kill most species instantly." "Most species, yes," Webb agreed. "But humans have always been surprisingly hard to kill." He turned back to the display and began explaining his theory. While other species had approached the barriers as a technological problem, Webb had been studying them as a psychological one. The barriers were not just machines left behind by an ancient civilization. They were a test. "Look at the construction pattern," he said, highlighting different sections of the barriers. "The energy flows don't follow optimal engineering principles. They follow problem-solving principles. These barriers were designed to require specific types of thinking to maintain them." The theory was radical and completely unproven. Webb believed that the ancient builders had created the barriers as a puzzle. Not just any species could maintain them. It required a particular combination of traits: the ability to think outside conventional parameters, the willingness to take extreme risks, and the capacity to function under impossible pressure. "You're saying the barriers are failing because no one has been solving them correctly?" Captain Vasquez asked. "Exactly. Every species that has tried to fix them has used conventional approaches. Careful planning, systematic analysis, gradual implementation, but the barriers were designed to require the opposite approach." Webb pulled up a new display showing his proposed solution. Instead of trying to repair the barriers directly, they would use the barrier's own energy fluctuations against them. By creating specific resonance patterns, they could trick the barrier system into repairing itself. "It's like telling a lie to someone who's trying to catch you in a lie," he explained. "You have to think like the person who built the trap." The plan was theoretically sound but practically suicidal. Someone would have to pilot a ship directly into the barrier's energy matrix. From there, they would need to manually adjust resonance frequencies while the barrier system tried to tear them apart at the atomic level. Dr. Sarah Kim, the mission's xenopsychologist, studied the data with a frown. The psychological profile of the barrier builders suggests they valued sacrifice and determination above intelligence. They wanted to ensure that only species willing to risk everything could maintain the barriers, which explains why every safe, careful approach has failed, Webb concluded. "The barriers are designed to reject cautious solutions." Captain Vasquez looked at the mission parameters again. "So we need to fly into an energy field that operates by laws of physics we don't understand, manually adjust equipment that could explode at any moment, and do it all while space-time itself tries to tear us apart." "That's a very accurate summary," Webb replied. "Sounds like a typical human mission," Vasquez said with a grin. The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Human engineering teams worked around the clock to modify the research vessel Prometheus. They stripped out every non-essential system and replaced them with specialized equipment for barrier interaction. The modifications were based on Webb's theoretical work, but there was no time for proper testing. They were building the parachute on the way down, as humans like to say. Other species would have demanded years of careful testing and simulation. Humans had 18 hours. Meanwhile, communication teams established contact with the fleeing evacuation fleets. Billions of beings were racing away from the barrier zones as fast as their ships could carry them. Some had been traveling for days already, leaving behind entire civilizations in their desperate flight. "The Galactic Council is monitoring our progress," reported Communications Officer Torres. "They're not optimistic." "Of course they're not," Webb replied. "Optimism requires believing that impossible things can become possible. That's a very human trait." As the Prometheus finished its modifications, Webb made a final check of his calculations. The math was complex, but the concept was simple. Instead of fighting the barriers, they would work with them. Instead of trying to impose human solutions on alien technology, they would let the technology teach them what it needed. "Dr. Webb," Captain Vasquez called from the bridge, "we're ready to depart. Are you sure about this?" Webb looked at the display one more time. In 18 hours, the barriers would fail completely. Void entities would pour into their dimension like water through a broken dam. Everything they knew and loved would be consumed by hungry darkness. "No," he admitted, "I'm not sure at all. But uncertainty has never stopped humans before." The Prometheus launched from its dock and began the journey toward the failing barriers. Behind them, the greatest minds in the galaxy watched and waited. Some hoped for a miracle. Most expected to witness the spectacular failure of human arrogance. But Dr. Marcus Webb had spent his entire career studying impossible problems. He had learned that the word impossible was often just another way of saying, nobody has tried the right approach yet. And humans had always been very good at finding the right approach, even when nobody else could see it. The Prometheus shuddered as it entered the outer edge of the barrier energy field. Captain Elena Vasquez gripped her command chair as reality seemed to flicker around them. The laws of physics were more like suggestions here, and human technology was being pushed far beyond its limits. Energy levels are off the charts, reported Chief Engineer Rodriguez from the engine room. The modifications are holding but barely. We're running everything at 200% capacity. Through the view screen, the crew could see the barriers themselves. They looked like enormous walls of liquid light stretching across space, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The failing sections pulsed with angry red energy, like infected wounds in the fabric of reality. 12 hours until complete failure, announced Dr. Webb from his monitoring station. The decay rate is accelerating. We need to begin the resonance calibration now. The past 6 hours had been a nightmare of constant adjustment and recalibration. Every system on the ship had to be manually tuned to match the barrier's chaotic energy patterns. Computers kept overloading from the feedback, forcing the crew to rely on human intuition and quick reflexes. Dr. Lisa Park stumbled as another energy wave hit the ship. She had been working without sleep for 36 hours, surviving on stimulants and determination. Dark circles ringed her eyes, but her hands were still steady as she adjusted the resonance controls. "I'm reading massive instability in Section 7, she reported. "The energy matrix is collapsing faster than our models predicted." Dr. Sarah Kim looked up from her psychological analysis console. Her job was to study the behavioral patterns in the barrier system, looking for clues about what the ancient builders had wanted. It was like trying to read the mind of someone who had been dead for millions of years. "The instability isn't random," she observed. "There's a pattern to it. The barriers are responding to our presence, but not defensively. It's more like confusion, Captain Vasquez asked while fighting to keep the ship stable in the chaotic energy field. "Think about it," Dr. Kim explained. "These barriers have been operating automatically for millions of years. Every species that approached them tried to fix them like machines. But what if they're not machines? What if they're more like living systems?" The idea was wild, but it fit with Dr. Webb's theory about the barriers being a test. Perhaps the ancient builders had created something that was part technology and part consciousness, something that needed to be understood rather than simply repaired. Another violent shake ran through the ship. In the medical bay, Dr. Chen was treating crew members who had been affected by exposure to the barrier energy. 3 people were experiencing temporary psychotic episodes caused by having their brains bombarded with extra-dimensional radiation. The human nervous system wasn't designed for this, Dr. Chen reported over the comm system. "We're pushing our people beyond safe limits." "Noted," Captain Vasquez replied grimly. "How much longer can we maintain current operations?" 6 hours, maybe 8 if we're lucky. That gave them just enough time if everything went perfectly. But nothing had gone perfectly so far, and there was no reason to expect that to change. Ensign Martinez, the youngest member of the crew, was monitoring the barrier's response to their calibration attempts. His job was to watch for any signs that their approach was working. So far, the signs were not encouraging. "Captain," he called out, "I'm reading massive energy buildup in the core matrix. It's like the barriers are preparing for something." Before anyone could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the ship. The barrier system had detected their calibration attempts and was fighting back. Feedback loops overloaded circuits, sending sparks flying from control panels. "All hands, brace for impact," Vasquez shouted. The energy wave hit them like a giant fist. Systems failed across the ship as the barrier's defenses activated. For a terrifying moment, the Prometheus was completely dead in space, drifting helplessly in the chaotic energy field. "Emergency power online," Rodriguez reported, "but we've lost main computer control. Everything will have to be done manually." Dr. Webb looked at his displays in amazement rather than despair. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's exactly what they wanted." "What do you mean?" Dr. Park asked while frantically trying to restart the resonance controls. "The barriers rejected our automated systems," Webb explained. "They forced us to operate manually. The ancient builders didn't want machines to maintain their creation. They wanted living beings making conscious choices. It was a breakthrough in understanding, but it came at a terrible cost. Without computer assistance, the crew had to perform incredibly complex calculations by hand. They had to adjust resonance frequencies by feel rather than measurement. It was like trying to perform brain surgery while blindfolded. Yet somehow they were succeeding. Hour by hour, the barrier's decay rate began to slow. The red warning zone started to stabilize. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The Galactic Council is requesting hourly updates, Communications Officer Torres reported. They want to know if we're making any real progress. Tell them we're learning, Captain Vasquez replied. Sometimes that's the most important kind of progress. Dr. Kim made another crucial observation as they entered their 10th hour of work. The barriers aren't just responding to our technical adjustments. They're responding to our emotional state. When we're frustrated or afraid, the instability increases. When we're calm and focused, things improve. You're saying the barriers can sense our feelings? Ensign Martinez asked. I'm saying they were designed by beings who understood that technology and consciousness are connected. They built something that requires both technical skill and emotional intelligence to operate. As the 12th hour approached, exhaustion was taking its toll on the crew. Several people had collapsed from fatigue and had to be replaced by backup personnel. The constant exposure to barrier energy was causing hallucinations and disorientation, but they were also achieving something unprecedented. The barrier decay rate had slowed to almost nothing in the sections they were working on. Other sections were still failing rapidly, but they had proven that the barriers could be stabilized. We're running out of time, Dr. Webb announced as he checked their progress. We've stabilized maybe 10% of the critical sections. At this rate, we won't finish before the barriers fail completely. Captain Vasquez studied the tactical display. They had 12 more hours to save the galaxy, and they had barely made a dent in the problem. Any reasonable person would have given up, but humans had never been particularly reasonable. All right, people, she announced over the ship's communication system. We've proven it can be done. Now we need to do it faster and better than anyone thought possible. Time to show the galaxy what humans are really capable of. The response was immediate. Despite their exhaustion, despite the danger, despite the impossible odds, the crew of the Prometheus doubled their efforts. They began working in shifts around the clock, pushing themselves and their equipment beyond all safe limits. Because that's what humans did when faced with the impossible. They didn't accept defeat. They didn't calculate the odds. They just kept working until they found a way to win. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough. With only 2 hours remaining before complete barrier failure, disaster struck the Prometheus like a lightning bolt from an angry god. The massive feedback surge came without warning. One moment the crew was making steady progress on the resonance calibration, and the next moment every system on the ship was screaming in electronic agony. Sparks erupted from control panels as circuits overloaded. The lights flickered and died, plunging sections of the ship into darkness. Main computer is down, Chief Engineer Rodriguez shouted over the alarm klaxons. Complete system failure across all primary networks. Captain Elena Vasquez felt her heart sink as she realized what this meant. Without the computer systems, they could not maintain the precise calculations needed for barrier calibration. They were essentially flying blind in one of the most dangerous regions of space ever discovered. Emergency power to critical systems only, she ordered. How long until we can restore main computer function? That's the problem, Captain, Rodriguez replied grimly. The feedback surge didn't just shut down the computer. It fried the quantum processors. We're looking at complete hardware replacement, which would take days even in a proper shipyard. Dr. Webb stared at his now dead monitoring station in disbelief. They had been so close to understanding the barrier system. The patterns were finally starting to make sense. And now they were back to operating with Stone Age technology. Can we continue the calibration manually? Dr. Park asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer. The math requires quantum-level precision, Webb explained. We're talking about calculations that involve 17 different dimensions simultaneously. Even with computer assistance, we were pushing the limits of what's possible. Dr. Sarah Kim looked up from her psychology console, which was now displaying nothing but static. Wait, she said slowly. What if that's exactly what was supposed to happen? Everyone turned to look at her. In the dim emergency lighting, her face was pale but determined. Think about it, she continued. Every time we've made progress, it's been because we abandoned conventional approaches. The computer failure isn't a disaster. It's the next step in the test. You're suggesting the barriers deliberately destroyed our computer systems? Captain Vasquez asked. I'm suggesting that whoever built these barriers wanted to ensure that only beings capable of true intuitive understanding could maintain them. Computers can calculate, but they can't feel. They can't empathize. They can't make the kind of emotional connections that consciousness requires. As if to confirm her theory, the barrier energy patterns around their ship began to shift. The chaotic fluctuations that had been attacking their systems suddenly became more stable. It was as if the barriers were waiting to see what the humans would do next. Dr. Webb pulled out an old-fashioned notebook and began scribbling equations by hand. If Dr. Kim is right, then we need to approach this problem completely differently. Instead of trying to calculate the exact resonance frequencies, we need to feel our way to the correct patterns. Feel our way? Ensign Martinez asked. How do you feel quantum resonance patterns? The same way you feel music, Dr. Kim replied. The same way you know when something is right or wrong without being able to explain why. The barriers aren't just technology. They contain traces of consciousness from their builders. She moved to the center of the bridge and closed her eyes, extending her hands toward the barrier energy field, visible through the view screen. I can sense something out there. It's not alive exactly, but it's not completely dead either. It's like an echo of the beings who created this place. The rest of the crew watched in fascination as Dr. Kim began to describe what she was sensing. The barriers weren't failing because they were broken. They were failing because they were lonely. For millions of years, they had waited for someone to understand their purpose, to acknowledge the sacrifice of their creators. The builders died to create these barriers, she explained, her eyes still closed. They poured their consciousness into the energy matrix as a final act of protection for the galaxy. But consciousness can't survive in isolation forever. It needs connection, understanding, empathy. Dr. Webb stopped writing and looked up from his notebook. You're saying the barriers are dying of loneliness? I'm saying they're dying because no one has ever tried to communicate with them. Every species that attempted repairs treated them like machines. But they're not machines. They're monuments, memorials. They're the preserved consciousness of an entire civilization. Captain Vasquez felt a chill run down her spine as she began to understand the implications. So how do we communicate with the consciousness of a dead civilization? The same way we communicate with anyone, Dr. Kim replied. We listen. We empathize. We acknowledge their sacrifice and their pain. It was the most unscientific approach anyone had ever proposed for solving a galactic crisis. No equations, no technical procedures, no systematic analysis. Just human beings trying to understand and comfort the echo of ancient minds. But as Dr. Kim began to speak to the barriers, something extraordinary happened. The chaotic energy patterns around the ship started to calm. The violent fluctuations that had been tearing at their hull began to settle into more stable rhythms. It's working, whispered Dr. Park, watching her instruments in amazement. The resonance patterns are stabilizing on their own. Dr. Kim opened her eyes and looked directly at the barrier energy field. I can feel them, she said quietly. They've been alone for so long. They're afraid. They're tired. They want to rest, but they can't abandon their duty. What do they need from us? Captain Vasquez asked. They need to know that someone understands what they sacrificed. They need to know that their civilization is remembered, and they need to know that someone else will take responsibility for protecting the galaxy. The crew of the Prometheus looked at each other with growing realization. The solution to the barrier crisis wasn't technical at all. It was emotional. The ancient builders had created a system that could only be maintained by beings capable of true empathy and understanding. Dr. Webb began to see the bigger picture. They designed the barriers to test any species that tried to maintain them. Technical skill alone isn't enough. You need the ability to connect with consciousness, even consciousness that's vastly different from your own. And humans, Dr. Kim added with a small smile, have always been very good at making connections with beings that others consider impossible to understand. With 1 hour remaining before complete barrier failure, the crew of the Prometheus began the most unusual repair procedure in galactic history. Instead of adjusting equipment, they talked to the barriers. Instead of running calculations, they shared their own experiences of loss and sacrifice, and slowly, amazingly, the barriers began to respond. The ancient consciousness trapped within the energy matrix started to trust these strange beings who had come not to fix them, but to understand them. For the first time in millions of years, the builder's sacrifice was truly acknowledged, but acknowledgement was only the first step. The real test was yet to come. In the final hour before complete barrier failure, something impossible began to happen. Across the galaxy, Monitoring stations registered readings that defied every known law of physics. The failing void barriers, which had been dying for 3 years, suddenly began to strengthen. Energy levels that had been dropping steadily toward zero started climbing back toward normal operational parameters. High Counselor Zeftari stood in the central command center, staring at displays that showed what every expert had declared impossible. "Are these readings accurate?" she demanded. "Confirmed across all monitoring networks," reported the chief technician. "The barriers are not just stabilizing, they're regenerating. Energy output is increasing by the minute." Meanwhile, aboard the Prometheus, Dr. Sarah Kim sat in the center of the bridge with her eyes closed, tears streaming down her face. She was no longer just communicating with the barrier consciousness. She was experiencing their memories, feeling their emotions, understanding their desperate loneliness after eons of isolation. "I can see them," she whispered to her crewmates. "The builders. They were so much like us. They had families, dreams, fears. When the void entities first threatened the galaxy, they knew that stopping them would require the ultimate sacrifice. The ancient builders had poured their life force into the barrier matrix, creating a protective shell around their dimension. But consciousness cannot exist forever without connection to other minds. Over millions of years, the preserved awareness within the barriers had slowly begun to fade. "They're not just technology," Dr. Kim continued. "They're the ghosts of heroes who died to save everything they loved. And they've been waiting all this time for someone to simply say thank you." Captain Elena Vasquez watched the barrier energy patterns shift and change on the view screen. What had been chaotic and violent was now becoming beautiful and purposeful. The barriers were remembering how to be whole. "What do they need from us now?" she asked. "They need to know that their sacrifice meant something," Dr. Kim replied. "They need to know that the galaxy they died to protect has grown into something worthy of their sacrifice." Dr. Webb looked up from his manual calculations. The numbers were still important, but now they made sense in a way they never had before. The barriers aren't just protecting us from the void entities. They're teaching us. Every species that tried to maintain them had to demonstrate specific qualities: courage, empathy, the willingness to sacrifice for others. A test of character, Captain Vasquez realized. They were looking for a species worthy of inheriting their responsibility. As understanding dawned on the human crew, the barriers responded with a surge of power that lit up space for light years in every direction. The ancient consciousness was no longer alone. After millions of years, they had found minds that could truly comprehend their purpose. Dr. Kim opened her eyes and looked at her crewmates. "They're offering us a choice. They can regenerate the barriers completely, stronger than ever before. But it means accepting responsibility for maintaining them. Not just technically, but spiritually. We would become the guardians of the galaxy." The weight of the offer was staggering. Humanity was being asked to take on a role that had been held by beings millions of years more advanced. They were being offered guardianship over the safety of every living thing in the known universe. "The other species won't understand at first," Dr. Webb pointed out. "They'll think we're overreaching, claiming authority we haven't earned." "Let them think what they want," Captain Vasquez replied firmly. "We're not doing this for recognition. We're doing this because it needs to be done, and we're the ones here to do it." The decision was unanimous. Every member of the Prometheus crew agreed to accept the responsibility that the ancient builders were offering. They would become the first human barrier guardians, protectors of a technology they barely understood, but could feel in their hearts. As they made their commitment, the barriers exploded with new life. Energy patterns that had been fading for years suddenly blazed with renewed power. The void entities, which had been pressing against the weakening barriers for decades, found themselves pushed back into their own dimension. Throughout the galaxy, evacuation fleets stopped their desperate flight as monitoring stations confirmed the impossible. Not only were the barriers stable, they were stronger than they had been in recorded history. The transformation took exactly 24 hours from the moment Ambassador Sarah Chen had first stood up in the Galactic Council chamber. In one day, humanity had achieved what no other species had managed in millennia. But the real miracle wasn't the technical achievement. It was the connection they had forged with consciousness from beyond time. The human crew of the Prometheus had done more than repair ancient technology. They had comforted the spirits of long-dead heroes and accepted the sacred trust of protecting future generations. As news of the success spread across the galaxy, reactions were mixed. Some species expressed gratitude and amazement. Others questioned how such a young race could succeed where ancient civilizations had failed. A few even suggested that humanity had somehow cheated or gotten impossibly lucky. Ambassador Sarah Chen addressed these concerns when she spoke to the Galactic Council 3 days later. "We didn't succeed because we're smarter or more advanced than other species," she explained. "We succeeded because we approached the problem as a human problem rather than a technical problem. The barriers were never broken. They were grieving. They needed someone to acknowledge their pain and share their burden. Humans have always been good at connecting with others, even when those others seem impossible to understand." High Counselor Zeftari listened to the ambassador's explanation with growing respect. "And you accept the responsibility of maintaining these barriers for future generations?" "We accept the responsibility of sharing that task with any species willing to learn what the barriers really need," Sarah replied. "The builders didn't create a technology that only humans could operate. They created a test that any species with sufficient empathy and courage could pass." In the months that followed, several other species began working with human barrier specialists to learn the art of consciousness-based maintenance. The Kethmori, despite their initial skepticism, proved surprisingly adept at the empathic techniques required. Even the ancient Vorth Hai admitted that humanity had taught them something new about the connection between technology and consciousness, but it was the barriers themselves that provided the greatest validation of humanity's approach. Under human guardianship, they didn't just maintain their protective function. They began to evolve, growing stronger and more sophisticated as the barrier consciousness learned to trust their new caretakers. Dr. Sarah Kim, now the first director of barrier psychology, established training programs to help other species develop the emotional intelligence needed for barrier maintenance. Her first lecture to an interspecies audience began with a simple statement: "The greatest technologies are not just machines. They are relationships. And the key to maintaining any relationship is the same across all species. Listen with your heart, not just your mind." The void entities, sensing the renewed strength of the barriers, retreated deeper into their own dimension. They would return someday, as they always did. But when they came, they would find the galaxy protected not just by ancient technology, but by the combined consciousness of every species willing to stand guard. And at the center of that alliance, providing the empathy and understanding that made it all possible, would be the species that had learned long ago that the most impossible problems often had the simplest solutions. Humanity had saved the galaxy not through superior technology or ancient wisdom, but through the basic human ability to care about the pain of others, even others they had never met who had died millions of years ago. In just 24 hours, humans had achieved what no species could. They had proven that sometimes the greatest power in the universe is simply the willingness to listen, to understand and to carry the burdens that others can no longer bear. The barriers stood strong, protected by the ghosts of ancient heroes and watched over by their newest guardians. And across the galaxy, billions of beings slept safely, never knowing that their protection came not from invincible technology, but from the simple human truth that no one should face the darkness alone.